The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was one of those mornings that felt like it could go on forever, calm, peaceful, and predictable. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A young mom stepped out of her house, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand while holding her keys in the other. Her baby boy, barely a few weeks old, was fast asleep in his car seat, tucked safely in the back seat of her SUV. She had parked right in the driveway, as she always did, thinking nothing of it. After all, this was a safe neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone here. Kids rode their bikes down the streets without a care in the world, and neighbors exchanged warm smiles during evening walks. She opened the trunk, placing the groceries inside carefully so as not to wake her little one. He looked so peaceful, bundled up snugly in his blanket. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of him. Being a single mom wasn't easy, especially with a newborn who needed constant attention, but moments like these made everything worth it. Just seeing his tiny face filled her heart with joy. Little did she know, someone was watching. Across the street, a teenager lounged on the porch of his family's sprawling home. He came for money. His dad was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and they lived in one of the biggest houses in the area. This kid had grown up getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Fancy clothes? Check. The latest gadgets? Check. A brand new sports car for his birthday? Not quite. He'd been begging his parents for months, but they kept saying no. You're too young, they told him. You need to learn responsibility first. But he didn't see it that way. All he saw was that his friends were driving flashy cars and he wasn't. And today, after yet another argument with his folks about why he deserved a car, frustration bubbled inside him. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, and plopped down on the porch steps. His eyes wandered aimlessly until they landed on the SUV parked across the street. It wasn't anything fancy, a practical vehicle, perfect for running errands or taking kids to school. But to him, it looked irresistible. An idea sparked in his mind, reckless and impulsive, but also thrilling. What if he took it? Just for a spin? No one would even notice, right? Besides, how hard could it be to hotwire a car? He'd seen it. Done in movies plenty of times. As the young mom ducked back into the house to grab the last grocery bag. Leaving her baby asleep in the back seat, the teenager saw his chance. Without a second thought, he sprinted across the street, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. He slid into the driver's seat, fumbling with the wires under the steering column. To his surprise, the engine roared to life within seconds. Adrenaline surged through him as he shifted into gear and sped off, tires screeching against the asphalt. He didn't notice the tiny figure in the rearview mirror. Didn't hear the faint coos coming from the backseat. All he cared about was the rush, the freedom of speeding down the road in a car that wasn't his. For a moment, he felt untouchable, invincible even. But deep down, a small voice whispered that he'd crossed a line. He ignored it, pushing the thought aside as he gunned the accelerator. Meanwhile, the young mom returned outside, her arms full of groceries. At first, she thought maybe she'd parked the car somewhere else by mistake. Maybe she was more tired than she realized. But as reality sank in, panic gripped her chest. Her car was gone, and worse, her baby was still in the back seat. Her hands trembled as she dropped the grocery bag, spilling cans and boxes onto the driveway. "No, no, no," she whispered, scanning the empty street in disbelief. Neighbors started to notice her distress and rushed over, asking what was wrong. When she explained what happened, their faces turned pale. One of them immediately called 911 while others tried to comfort her, though it was clear she was beyond consoling. Standing there, Clutching her phone, she felt a wave of terror wash over her. Who would do something like this? Why would anyone steal a car with a baby inside? Questions swirled in her mind, each one more horrifying than the last. All she could think about was her son, her precious, innocent son, and whether he was safe. Back on the road, the teenager was beginning to realize the gravity of what he'd done. As the initial excitement wore off, guilt crept in. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, catching a glimpse of the car seat. His stomach churned. What had he gotten himself into? For the first time in his privileged life, he felt truly scared. But instead of pulling over or calling for help, fear paralyzed him. He kept driving, hoping against hope that somehow everything would work out. And so, the stage was set for a story that would shake the entire community to its core, a tale of recklessness, fear, and ultimately, redemption. Because sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to realize the value of human life. And for both the young mom and the reckless teen, this was only the beginning. The young mom stood frozen in her driveway, staring at the empty space where her SUV had been just moments ago. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of her chest. The world around her seemed to blur. Neighbors talking, cars passing by, the distant hum of a lawnmower, all of it faded into background noise. All she could focus on was the fact that her baby was gone. Her tiny, helpless newborn was out there somewhere, strapped into a car seat, with no idea what was happening. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "My baby," she whispered over and over again, her voice cracking with every word. A neighbor knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll find him," they said firmly, though their own voice shook. Another neighbor was already on the phone with 911, explaining the situation as calmly as possible while trying not to let the panic in their tone show. "Ma'am, can you confirm your vehicle description?" The dispatcher asked, their voice steady but urgent. "It's a gray SUV," the neighbor replied, glancing at the mom for confirmation. She nodded weakly, still clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "Gray SUV, license plate number?" The neighbor rattled off the details as quickly as they could, adding, "There's a newborn in the back seat, a baby boy." On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, a mix of professionalism and barely concealed concern. "We're sending units your way immediately. Stay calm and stay put." Easier said than done. How could anyone stay calm when their child's life hung in the balance? As the minutes ticked by, the young mom paced back and forth, her mind racing. With worst-case scenarios, what if someone hurt him? What if he got too hot or too cold? What if she couldn't even finish the thought before another wave of nausea hit her? Neighbors did their best to keep her grounded, offering water, tissues, anything to help. But nothing could ease the knot of fear twisting in her stomach. Meanwhile, miles away, the teenager behind the wheel was starting to realize just how much trouble he was in. At first, the thrill of driving a stolen car had been intoxicating. He'd cranked up the radio, blasting music to drown out any lingering doubts about what he'd done. But now, reality was catching up fast. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes landed on the car seat and the realization that there was a real, living baby in it. He tried to convince himself that everything would be fine. Babies slept through anything, right? This one probably hadn't even woken up yet. Still, guilt gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe. He wasn't a bad person, or at least, he didn't think he was. Sure, he'd made mistakes before, but this was different. This wasn't just some prank or harmless rebellion. This was dangerous. This was wrong. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he sped down unfamiliar roads, unsure where he was going or what he planned to do next. Part of him wanted to stop, pull over, and call for help. But fear held him back. Fear of getting caught. fear of facing the consequences. So instead, he kept driving, weaving recklessly between cars, ignoring honks and angry shouts from other drivers. Back in the neighborhood, police arrived within minutes, lights flashing but sirens silent to avoid causing more distress. Officers approached the young mom cautiously, introducing themselves and asking for details. She struggled to speak clearly, choking on her words as she described the SUV and her baby. One officer gently reassured her, saying, "We'll do everything we can to bring him home safe." While some officers began canvassing the area, others reviewed security footage from nearby homes. Thankfully, several neighbors had cameras installed outside their houses. Within half an hour, investigators found a clip showing a figure slipping into the SUV and speeding off. The image was grainy, but clear enough to identify the culprit, a teenage boy, unmistakably recognizable despite the hood pulled low over his face. Word spread quickly among the officers. "Got a match," one of them muttered into their radio. "Male, late teens, matches the description of the HOA president's son." Everyone exchanged grim looks. Of all the people who could have done something like this, why did it have to be someone from such a prominent family? News traveled fast in small neighborhoods, and soon whispers rippled through the community. Parents gathered on sidewalks, shaking their heads in disbelief. "That kid?" One woman murmured to her husband, "I thought he was just spoiled, not this reckless." Others expressed outrage, vowing to support the young mom however they could. Flower pots were left on her porch with notes of encouragement. Someone brought over a warm meal, knowing she wouldn't have the energy to cook that as the hours dragged on. The young mom alternated between pacing and sitting motionless, staring blankly into space. Each ring of her phone sent her heart racing, hoping it was news about her baby. But every call turned out to be a concerned friend or relative checking in. The waiting was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. Then, finally, a breakthrough. Officers received a tip-off from a gas station attendant who reported seeing a suspicious gray SUV parked haphazardly near the pumps earlier that morning. Inside, they'd spotted a baby carrier in the backseat. Though the vehicle was long gone by the time authorities arrived, surveillance footage confirmed it was indeed the stolen car. More importantly, it showed the driver, a nervous-looking teenager, pacing anxiously beside the vehicle before hopping back in and speeding off. "This is good," one detective told the team. "We're closing in." They traced the route the SUV had taken, piecing together clues until they narrowed down its likely location. Meanwhile, helicopters scoured the skies, searching for any sign of the missing vehicle. For the young mom, the wait felt endless. But deep down, she clung to hope that her baby was okay, hope that justice would prevail, and hope that somehow, someway, this nightmare would come to an end. Because no matter how dark things seemed, she knew she couldn't give up, not when her son needed her most. The teenager behind the wheel was in full panic mode now. His reckless joyride had spiraled far beyond anything he'd imagined when he first decided to take the SUV. What started as a moment of impulsive anger, a way to lash out at his parents for refusing him yet another expensive toy, had turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Every turn, every bump in the road felt heavier than the last, like the weight of his choices was pressing down on him. He glanced at the rearview mirror again and saw the baby still strapped securely in the backseat. The sight made his stomach churn. He wasn't sure if the infant was awake or asleep, but the thought of him being there, completely helpless, hit him harder than anything else ever had. For someone who had spent most of his life insulated by privilege, this was uncharted territory. This wasn't just about getting caught anymore. It was about realizing that his actions had real consequences for someone else's life, his hands. were slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. He should have stopped. He should have called for help. But fear kept him moving forward. Fear of what his parents would say, fear of what the cops would do, fear of facing the truth about how badly he'd messed up. So instead, he kept driving, weaving through traffic like a man possessed, trying to outrun not just the police but also the guilt gnawing at him. And then it happened. The teenager rounded a sharp curve too fast, his tires losing traction on the slick pavement. The SUV skidded sideways, fishtailing wildly before slamming into a tree with a deafening crash. Airbags exploded, filling the cabin with white powder and smoke. The impact jolted the car seat violently, and the baby let out a piercing wail, loud enough to cut through the chaos and pierce straight into the teenager's heart. For a moment, everything went silent except for the sound of the baby crying. The teenager sat stunned, staring ahead at the crumpled hood of the SUV, his mind racing. Was the baby hurt? Did he cause permanent damage? He unbuckled his seatbelt shakily and turned around to check. To his shock and relief, the baby seemed okay. The car seat had done its job, keeping him secure despite the force of the collision. Still screaming, yes, but alive. But the teenager didn't stick around to make sure. Panic overtook him again. He knew people would be coming soon, police, paramedics, maybe even reporters. If they found him here, he'd be finished. So without thinking twice, he bolted from the wreckage, abandoning the baby in the back seat. He ran blindly down the street, his hoodie pulled low over his face, trying to put as much distance between himself and the scene as possible. Back in the neighborhood, a young mom was pacing her driveway, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Hours had passed since her SUV disappeared with her newborn inside, and though the police assured her they were doing everything they could, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every second felt like an eternity. Each ring of her phone sent her heart racing, hoping for good news. But each call ended in disappointment. When the call finally came, it wasn't what she expected. A police officer informed her that the SUV had been located, but it had been involved in a serious accident. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. "My baby?" She managed to choke out, her voice trembling. "He's safe," the officer said quickly, sensing her terror. "Emergency. Responders are on the scene. They're taking him to the hospital for evaluation, but preliminary reports suggest he's unharmed." Relief washed over her like a tidal wave, followed immediately by anger. Safe? Yes. Unharmed? Thank God. But how dare someone put her child through this? How dare anyone treat another human being, let alone a defenseless baby, with such disregard? She jumped into a neighbor's car without hesitation, tears streaming down her face as they sped toward the hospital. Along the way, details trickled in. Witnesses at the crash site described seeing a teenage boy fleeing the scene. Police were already searching for him, following leads and reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses. It wouldn't take long to track him down. At the hospital, doctors and nurses surrounded the baby, checking him thoroughly for any signs of injury. X-rays confirmed no broken bones, and after a thorough examination, they declared him physically fine. Exhausted from the ordeal, the baby drifted off to sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Watching him, the young mom felt a mix of emotions: gratitude that he was alive, fury at whoever had caused this, and sheer determination to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. As she held her sleeping son close, she vowed to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all the other parents who might find themselves in similar situations one day. Someone needed to hold these reckless individuals accountable, and she wasn't going to back down until that happened. Meanwhile, the teenager had holed up in a friend's basement, shaking uncontrollably as he replayed the events in his head. His friend, bewildered by his sudden appearance, demanded answers. When the truth came spilling out, the friend looked horrified. "You did what?" he exclaimed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you realize how much trouble you're in?" The teenager nodded miserably. Of course, he realized. But realizing didn't change the fact that he'd made a colossal mistake, one that could cost him everything. Still, he clung to the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, he could talk his way out of it. Maybe his parents' influence could save him, or maybe the police wouldn't connect the dots. That hope vanished within hours. Officers tracked him down using witness descriptions and security footage from the area near the crash. They surrounded the house, lights flashing silently in the night. There was no escape. When they knocked on the door, the teenager froze, his heart pounding like a drum. "Open up," one officer shouted. "We know you're in there." His friend's parents ushered him outside, their faces pale with fear. As the officers cuffed him and read him his rights, the teenager hung his head in shame. Cameras clicked furiously as neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle. Some looked angry, others shocked. All of them whispered among themselves, wondering how something like this could happen in their quiet little community. As the squad car pulled away, the young mom received another update from the police. The suspect was in custody. She exhaled sharply, her body sagging with exhaustion. Justice might still feel far away, but this was a step in the right direction. At least now she knew who had taken her son and why. Sitting beside her baby's crib in the hospital room, she watched him sleep, his tiny fingers curled into fists. Despite everything, he looked peaceful, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded around him. She reached out and gently touched his hand, feeling a surge of love and protectiveness wash over her. The teenager sat in the backseat of the police car, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring blankly at the floor. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, but it couldn't hide the shame and fear written all over him. He'd spent most of his life thinking he was untouchable, protected by his family's wealth, their reputation, and the invisible shield that came with living in a gated community. But now, as the reality of what he'd done sank in deeper, with each passing second, none of that seemed to matter anymore. The ride to the station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. The officers didn't say much. They didn't need to. Their expressions said it all: disappointment, anger, disbelief. This wasn't just some petty crime or teenage prank gone wrong. It was reckless endangerment. A stolen car, a high-speed chase, an accident, and worst of all, a baby left screaming at the scene. How could anyone justify something like that? At the station, things moved quickly. The teenager was booked, fingerprinted, and led into an interrogation room where two detectives waited. One of them, a seasoned officer with graying hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward across the table. "You know why you're here," he said firmly, sliding a photo of the wrecked SUV toward the teenager. "Care to explain yourself?" The teenager hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "That's not how it works," the detective shot back, his tone icy. "You don't get to decide what happens when you break the law. You stole a car. You endangered a child. And then you ran away like a coward. Now you have to face the music." For hours, the questions kept coming. Why did he take the car? Did he realize there was a baby in the backseat? What was going through his mind during the crash? The teenager stumbled through his answers, trying to piece together explanations that sounded hollow even to his own ears. At one point, tears welled up in his eyes, but the detectives weren't swayed. They'd seen enough cases like this too. Know the difference between genuine remorse and crocodile tears. By the time the interrogation ended, the teenager was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He was placed in a holding cell while authorities contacted his parents. When they arrived at the station, their faces were a mix of fury and disbelief. His father, usually so composed and authoritative, looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His mother clutched her purse tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line as she struggled to process what had happened. "This isn't who we raised you to be," his father said sternly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea how serious this is?" The teenager nodded, unable to meet his parents' eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt truly small, like the world he thought he knew had crumbled around him. All the privileges, the excuses, the blind spots his family status afforded him suddenly seemed meaningless. He was just a scared kid sitting in a cold, sterile room, facing consequences he couldn't run from, back in the hospital. The young mom held her baby close, rocking him gently as he slept. Despite everything they'd been through, he seemed perfectly fine. No bruises, no broken bones, nothing more than a few sniffles from crying after the crash. Physically, he was okay. Emotionally, though, she wasn't sure either of them would ever fully recover. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. How could someone be so careless, so selfish? What kind of person steals a car without even checking if anyone is inside? And then abandons it and a baby at the scene of an accident. It made her blood boil just thinking about it, but anger wasn't the only emotion she felt. There was also sadness for the baby who'd been put through such trauma, for herself as a mother who'd nearly lost her child, and even for the teenager whose actions had spiraled so far out of control. She wondered what kind of upbringing could lead someone to behave the way he did. Was it neglect, entitlement, or just plain ignorance? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A police officer stepped inside, holding a folder. "We wanted to update you on the investigation," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "The suspect has been charged with grand theft auto, reckless driving, and child endangerment. We're building a strong case against him, and we'll do everything we can to ensure justice is served." The young mom nodded, relief washing over her, but only briefly. Justice felt like a distant concept right now, overshadowed by the raw emotions still coursing through her. She wanted answers, accountability, and closure. But more than anything, she wanted to make sure this never happened to another family. With that in mind, she began reaching out to others in the community. Friends, neighbors, local advocacy groups all rallied around her cause. Together, they organized meetings, shared stories, and brainstormed ways to raise awareness about juvenile delinquency and reckless behavior. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, urging parents to talk to their kids about responsibility and consequences. Social media posts spread like wildfire, drawing attention not just locally but nationally. The media picked up the story too, shining a spotlight on the dangers of unchecked privilege and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. News outlets interviewed experts, psychologists, and community leaders, all weighing in on how society could prevent similar incidents in the future. For the young mom, it was bittersweet. On one hand, she hated reliving the trauma publicly. On the other, she knew her voice mattered and that speaking out might save someone else's child down the line. The trial came months later, held in a packed courtroom filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of the community. The teenager sat slumped in his chair, dressed in a suit that looked too big for his frame. His parents sat beside him, their faces pale and drawn. Across the aisle, the young mom held her baby tightly, refusing to let go even for a moment. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence against the teenager. Surveillance footage showing him stealing the SUV, witness testimonies describing his erratic driving, and expert analysis proving negligence beyond a shadow of a doubt. His defense team argued that he was young, impulsive, and hadn't intended to harm anyone, but the judge wasn't convinced. During sentencing, Judge Margaret Hayes delivered a stern verdict. "What you did was reckless, dangerous, and completely unacceptable," she said, her voice firm. "You endangered not only your own life, but the lives of countless others, including an innocent infant. This court will not tolerate such behavior, regardless of age or background." The teenager was sentenced to juvenile detention until adulthood, along with mandatory counseling and community service once released. Additionally, his parents were ordered to pay restitution for damages and medical expenses related to the baby's ordeal. While the punishment wasn't perfect, it sent a clear message. Actions have consequences, no matter who you are. As the gavel fell, the young mom exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of emotions: relief that justice had been served, anger that it had come to this in the first place, and determination to keep fighting for change, not just for herself but for everyone affected by similar tragedies. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal for some, at least. The young mom focused on rebuilding her strength, cherishing every moment with her son. Neighbors grew closer, united by shared trauma and triumph. And as for the teenager, juvenile detention proved to be a turning point. Stripped of privileges and forced to confront the consequences of his choices, he began to mature. Weekly therapy sessions helped him understand empathy and responsibility, planting seeds of redemption that would take years to fully bloom, because sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way to find your way back up. And in this case, it brought a fractured community together, reminding everyone of the power of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. Months had passed since the trial, and life in the quiet suburban neighborhood was slowly returning to normal. The days were no longer filled with constant whispers about the crash or lingering glances at the teenager's house across the street. Instead, there was a sense of calm, a fragile peace that came from knowing justice had been served. But for those directly affected by the events, healing was an ongoing process. The young mom found herself settling into a new routine, one shaped by both gratitude and determination. Her baby boy, now several months older, was thriving, crawling around the living room, giggling at every silly face she made and lighting up her world in ways she never thought possible. Every milestone felt like a victory, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing it all. She cherished these moments more than ever before, savoring each laugh, each coo, as if it were a gift she didn't deserve but would fight to protect forever. But moving forward wasn't easy. Nightmares still haunted her sleep, visions of the empty driveway, the stolen SUV speeding away, the endless hours waiting for news about her son. Sometimes she woke up drenched in sweat, clutching her chest as though trying to hold her heart together. Other times, anger bubbled up unexpectedly during mundane tasks like folding laundry or grocery shopping. How could someone be so reckless? So selfish? Those questions lingered. Even when she tried to push them aside. To cope, she threw herself into advocacy work. The community meetings she'd helped organize had grown into something bigger, a grassroots movement aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Parents gathered regularly to discuss topics like teaching responsibility to teens, recognizing warning signs of risky behavior, and holding kids accountable without alienating them. Local schools invited her to speak at assemblies where she shared her story with raw honesty, urging students to think twice before making choices that could hurt others. At first, speaking publicly terrified her. Standing in front of a room full of strangers, reliving the worst day of her life, it took every ounce of courage she had. But over time, she realized the impact her words were having. Teenagers approached her after presentations, thanking her for sharing her perspective. Some admitted they'd never considered the ripple effects of their actions until hearing her story. Others promised to make better decisions, not just for themselves, but for the people around them. Watching these small shifts gave her hope, not just for her own future, but for the next generation. Meanwhile, the teenager adjusted to life behind bars. Juvenile detention wasn't glamorous. It was harsh, isolating, and humbling. Gone were the luxuries he'd once taken for granted: designer clothes, expensive gadgets, a spacious bedroom stocked with everything he could ever want. In their place were cold concrete walls, strict rules, and long days spent reflecting on the mess he'd created. At first, he struggled. The guilt weighed heavily on him, especially at night when the silence became deafening. He replayed the crash over and over in his mind, the screech of tires, the sound of metal crunching against the tree, the baby's cries echoing in his ears. What if things had turned out differently? What if the child hadn't survived? These thoughts kept him awake, gnawing at his conscience until he felt like he might suffocate under their weight. But slowly, change began to take root. Mandatory counseling sessions forced him to confront his emotions head-on, peeling back layers of denial and entitlement he'd built up over years of privilege. For the first time, he started seeing himself clearly, not as the misunderstood victim he'd convinced himself he was, but as someone who'd made a terrible mistake and needed to make amends. One breakthrough moment came during a group therapy session. A counselor asked the teens to write letters apologizing to those they'd hurt, even if they couldn't send them. The teenager hesitated at first, unsure where to begin. But as he put pen to paper, the words poured out faster than he expected. I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say it. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I stole a car. I endangered a life. I ran away instead of facing the truth. And now, because of me, a family went through hell. If I could go back and undo everything, I would. But I can't. All I can do is promise to be better, to learn from this, to grow, and to never let my actions hurt anyone again. When he read the letter aloud to the group, his voice cracked with emotion. Some of the other teens nodded in understanding. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the raw vulnerability in the room. But the counselor smiled softly, acknowledging the courage it took to admit fault. That moment marked the beginning of his transformation. By the time he was released from detention, he was a different person, or at least he was trying to be. His parents, too, had changed. They sold their oversized home and moved to a smaller house in a less affluent neighborhood, determined to start fresh. No more excuses. No more shielding their son from the real world. They enrolled him in a local high school where he blended in among peers who didn't know or care about his past. It was humbling but also freeing. He threw himself into volunteer work, mentoring troubled youth through outreach programs. At first, he worried no one would listen to him. Who would trust advice from someone who'd nearly destroyed a family? But to his surprise, the kids responded well to his honesty. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told them exactly what had happened, how it had felt to hit rock bottom, and why he was working so hard to rebuild his life. Seeing their faces light up with realization reminded him why he needed to keep going. Back in the neighborhood, the young mom watched these developments from afar. She heard rumors about the teenager's efforts to turn his life around, though she avoided seeking him out personally. Forgiveness didn't come easily, not yet anyway, but she found solace in the fact that he seemed genuinely committed to change. Maybe, someday, she'd be ready to forgive completely. Until then, she focused on raising her son and making the world a safer place for him. As the years rolled on, the community continued to heal. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now greeted each other warmly, united by shared experiences. Parents became more involved in their children's lives, fostering open communication and mutual respect. Even the HOA meetings took on a Different tone, less about nitpicking over fence colors and more about supporting one another through challenges big and small. And through it all, the young mom held on to hope. Hope that her son would grow up in a kinder, wiser world. Hope that the teenager's redemption story would inspire others to seek forgiveness and growth. Hope that even in tragedy, there could be beauty and resilience and connection in second chances.